Today we'll be discussing biochemistry. Biochemistry is the study of atoms and molecules of living things, as well as their interactions and chemical reactions. And when we're talking about biochemicals, we're largely talking about organic molecules. And the term organic actually comes from organism. And as you may have heard before, organisms are quote-unquote carbon-based life forms. And so when we look at the definition of organic molecules, there are some different definitions, but the ones that we're going to use is that organic molecules will be defined as having at least one carbon-hydrogen bond and will contain a chain of carbon atoms. So keep in mind that the shortest chain you could have would be 2 links, and so the shortest carbon chain you could have would be 2 carbons. So if a molecule doesn't fit that, or a compound does not fit that definition, then it would be an inorganic molecule. All right, so let's look at some different compounds and molecules and try to decide if they're organic or inorganic. So sodium chloride, we don't see any carbon chain, we don't see a carbon-hydrogen combination, so that's an inorganic compound. If we look at glucose, we can see that there are certainly 6 carbons, so there is a carbon chain. We also see the carbon-hydrogen combination, so that would be an organic molecule. Carbon dioxide, we see a carbon, but there's only 1 carbon. There's no carbon chain there, and there's no carbon-hydrogen combination, so carbon dioxide is considered an inorganic molecule. Oxygen, we see no carbon chain, we see no carbon-hydrogen combination, so that's inorganic. Carbon monoxide, you see the carbon. I know a lot of people want to consider that an organic, but it's not a carbon chain. There's no carbon-hydrogen combination, also inorganic. Ammonia, clearly I hope at this point inorganic. And then methane, only 1 carbon, but carbon-hydrogen combination, so methane is considered an organic molecule. Now, organic molecules tend to be composed of carbon chains, although the chains sometimes take on some circular or other shapes, and then there will be other groups attached to those. So when we talk about organic molecules, then the shape of the molecule is significant. Also, groups of elements that are attached to those carbon chains also contribute to the characteristics of organic molecules. Now, some organic molecules are extremely large. And so the basic unit of these large so-called macromolecules would be a monomer. And the word is literally saying one thing, or a single unit. So the prefix mono means single or one, mer means thing or unit. And you can put monomers together to form dimers, which would be 2 units or 2 things. And you can keep adding monomers to form polymers, which would be many things or many units. So again, a theme that we'll have here when we start talking about biochemistry in more detail is that large molecules will be composed of repeating units. Now, those repeating units in some cases will be exactly the same. And we refer to that kind of a polymer as a homopolymer. If the monomers are different from one another, we refer to that as a heteropolymer. So using our overhead camera, let's look at a couple of examples. So just using Legos here, I have exactly the same Lego, a blue Lego, the same size, and they're attached together. That is illustrating a homopolymer. And an example of that would be starch. Starch is composed of 100% glucose, just repeating glucose units that are attached to one another. Now let's contrast that then with a heteropolymer. So a heteropolymer then would be composed of different types of monomers that are attached to one another. And an example of a heteropolymer is a protein. Protein is composed of amino acids. There are 20 different amino acids which could be at each position here. So that's an example of a heteropolymer. Now, when you have monomers and we're going to put those together, what puts them together is a specific type of chemical reaction known as a dehydration or condensation reaction. And so, again, if we look at our before picture here, we have, a monomer. It doesn't really matter what it is, monomer A and monomer B. And you'll notice that there's a hydrogen hanging off one end and an OH group hanging off the other. And in organic chemistry, we refer to this as an alcohol group, but we'll just look at the H and the OH. Now, as you can probably guess, it is possible, if these came together at the right angle and so on, that the hydrogen might begin to share with the oxygen over here. And if we had H and OH, that would form water. So this is essentially what the after picture would look like then, is that if we take the water out, we dehydrate these molecules, that water just becomes part of the surrounding solution then. What will happen is that a carbon or other atom here will begin to covalently share electrons with a carbon or other atom here. And so they end up bonding together to form a dimer. If you added another monomer to this, then we would end up with a polymer. So again, what puts monomers together then are these dehydration reactions. And this would form a dimer in this case, but again, you could build a polymer the same way. So again, just another view of the same thing. If we're building a polymer, we see a hydrogen hanging out here. We put another monomer with an OH adjacent to that. They will spontaneously bond together, forming a polymer. Now the other side of that then would be what's known as a hydrolysis reaction. And that word literally means to split water. So you can break apart dimers or polymers by wedging water into this bond and splitting the water into an H and an OH, and then bonding those to each side. So again, water normally splits between the H and the OH. And we force that into the bond, and then that will split them apart. So when we look at nature, typically what's happening is that monomers are being put together, monomers are being split apart. They'll be put together by dehydration reactions, they'll be split apart by hydrolysis reactions. And again, a brief illustration showing again the same thing. If we have a polymer and if we force water into this bond, that can split them apart. Now let's go ahead and look at an animation illustrating first a dehydration reaction and then a hydrolysis reaction. And this won't have a lot of significance now, but there's also a molecule called an enzyme which helps coordinate these type of reactions. So an enzyme is going to bind the two monomers, put them in position for bonding, water will form, bonding them together. And then again, polymers can be built this way, as long as you have another monomer unit to add in. And then conversely, there are still other enzymes which help coordinate hydrolysis reactions. And so again, in a second, we're going to see another enzyme come in here. And that enzyme will come in and split the polymer apart. There it is. And it will force water, break the bond, and split the monomers apart. Okay? Now, as I mentioned previously, again, as we look at organic molecules, then there's typically a carbon skeleton, and then attached to that will be different groups that we associate with organic molecules. So one of these is a hydroxyl group, which is an OH group, and that is a water-soluble group, so-called polar group. Another example would be a carboxyl group. Carboxyls are organic acids. And so again, it's a COOH. And the COOH potentially can be an acid, and I'll be talking about acids later. Another example would be an amino group. The NH2 group here is an amino group. That's also a polar group, a water-soluble group. Another example would be phosphates, PO4, also water-soluble. Methyl groups, CH3, are non-polar, so they do not tend to dissolve in water very well. Now, we'll come back to organic molecules later, but there is an extremely important inorganic substance which we associate with life, and that is water. Let me say at the outset, I'm going to talk about the characteristics of water. There is no one characteristic of water that is unique to water. What makes water unique is the combination of characteristics that it exhibits. And it is so important to life, of course, that our astrophysicists and so on, when they're looking for life out there in the universe, they're not so much looking for life, they're looking for liquid water. And if liquid water exists or has existed, then there is at least the potential of life. So we really can't separate water from life, at least on this planet, and perhaps on other planets, and time will tell if that is true or not. So let's go ahead and consider some of the characteristics of water. Maybe the primary characteristic of water is that it is cohesive. And what that means is that cohesion is to stick like things together. So you may recall that water molecules, of course, are polar molecules, regions of slightly positive and negative ends. And so what this does then is create interactions between adjacent molecules. So water molecules tend to cling to one another. So if I were to take this molecule and move it in this direction, it will tend to pull the rest of these molecules with it. And that's why water forms droplets. So when you put water on a surface, it tends to form a droplet. That's different from oils. When you put oil on a surface, it runs flat. And that's because oils are not cohesive. All right, another characteristic of water is that it is adhesive. And so I'd like you to go ahead and look at a little demonstration we did earlier to show you this characteristic of adhesion. Another property of water is that it is adhesive. Adhesion is the property of sticking unlike substances together. So let's take an example. Let's say I want to stick this paper towel to that glass. If it's a dry paper towel, it's just going to drop off. It won't adhere to the glass. But let's go ahead and add water now to the paper towel and see what the effect is. So you can see there that the water molecules are clinging to the glass, they're clinging to the paper towel, and they're clinging to one another through the cohesion, and that sticks the paper towel to the glass. Another characteristic of water is that it exhibits what we call capillary action. Capillary action is the tendency of a liquid to move up a tube. And in this case, it's really dependent on the cohesive and adhesive natures of water. So I don't know if you've ever noticed, but if you have a drink or a beverage of some type and you have a straw in it, the fluid level in the straw is actually higher than it would be in your glass. And as it turns out, the thinner the tube, the thinner the straw, the higher the liquid will move. So for example, if you had a thick straw, the water would be at a certain height. If you had a thinner straw, it would be higher still. Thinner straw than that, higher still. So a tube is referred to as a capillary, and again, it is a tendency of water to move up tubes. Now at some point, gravity pulls on the water, so capillary action will only take water so far up a tube. But this is one of the characteristics of water that plants exploit. The trunk of a tree, there's a tissue in trees and plants that are known as xylem. And that tissue is composed of tiny tubules. And so water actually will, through capillary action, work its way up from the soil to the leaves. Now there are other forces there as well, but capillary action is just a natural characteristic of water that helps move water from roots to leaves. And so that helps the tree from wasting energy on moving water around. And again, it would be the fact that water will adhere to the sides of these tubules and then cohesively pull water molecules up with it that accounts for this capillary action. Now another characteristic of water, which traces back to its cohesive nature, is that water has a high surface tension. And so this is one of the things that allows insects, for example, to land on the surface of water or move around on the surface of water. If this insect, for example, had done this on oil, it would sink into the oil because oil, again, is nonpolar, it's non-cohesive, and you wouldn't have a high surface tension as a result. Okay, now the next three characteristics of water, again, we prepared a little video earlier that I would like you to look at. Another important characteristic of water is that water has a high specific heat. What that means is that water can absorb heat energy without changing temperature. And temperature is a measure of the amount of movement of particles. So, for example, I've got a beaker of water here on this hot plate, and it would be similar to the kind of thing you do at home. You put a pot of water on the stove. And so when you turn on the heat, the metal and the pot, or in this case the beaker, are going to get hot very rapidly. So what happens there is that the particles are vibrating very rapidly, and that's why the temperature goes up. That's why it feels hot. Now, in the case of water, you might recall the water molecules are cohesive. They tend to stick together. So as heat is introduced into that system, then the water molecules are kind of clinging to one another because of the hydrogen bonds that form. And so water has to overcome that cohesion, those water molecules, to get them moving faster. And so as a result then, water will heat more slowly than will the container or the metals or glass in this particular case. Now the other side of having a high specific heat is that once the water molecules are moving around, they have an inertia and they'll keep moving around. So they will maintain their heat for a longer period of time. So whereas in this case the glass and the metal of the hot plate will cool rapidly, The water will cool much more slowly because they continue to move for a longer period of time once they are in motion. So they'll release that heat more slowly. So that's what high specific heat is about. It heats more slowly and it cools more slowly. Now, high specific heat then is related to boiling point. So as you continue to increase the temperature and the particles are moving, the distance between them gets greater and greater, and eventually you reach the transition between liquid and gas. So when you reach that transition point, water molecules become gaseous. That's the boiling point of water, which would be 100 degrees centigrade. Now, the opposite end of the spectrum, water also has a very interesting characteristic, and it is that the solid form of water, which of course is ice, is less dense rather than the liquid water. Now that's unusual. Generally when you're talking about matter, the solid is the densest form of a substance, but in the case of water, the solid form is less dense than the liquid. So as water freezes, there's more space between the molecules. They'll form a crystalline structure. They'll trap air actually between them, and of course it floats as a result of that. And again, it's an important characteristic because when you look at how ecosystems function, of course we have a winter every year, and so what that ice will do on the top of a lake or a large pond sometimes is that it will create an insulating barrier that actually prevents the underlying water from freezing. So this is what allows animals of different types and other organisms to prevent or to get through a winter and not freeze solid in that winter. And so this is how life goes from year to year to year in these very cold aquatic environments. So again, these three characteristics then would be high specific heat, which leads to a high boiling point, and then the solid form of water, ice, is less dense than the liquid. Now I want to come back to high specific heat for just a second because it also has importance in that this is what helps mitigate extreme temperatures along the coastline. So again, when you look along our coastline here, water heats more slowly and releases that heat more slowly than the land masses do. So the closer you live to water, oceans at least, the less dramatic the swings of temperature are between daytime temperatures and nighttime temperatures. And of course that's related to high heat of vaporization, which I already discussed. And then also, of course, ice floats and that insulates underlying water. And again, if we look at liquid water, the particles will be much more dense than what happens as ice begins to form. So when ice forms, the water molecules form a crystal, trap air within those crystals, and as a result, the ice floats. Then the last characteristic I want to discuss is that water is a very good polar solvent. And what that means is that water will dissolve a number of different substances. So it tends to dissolve ionically bonded compounds, as we've discussed before, and it tends to do that by wedging between them and separating them. So when you put salt in water and stir it up, the salt dissolves because the sodium and the chlorine are being separated by water molecules, and you'll have separate chlorine and sodium ions. Now, nonpolar covalent molecules, like proteins, for example, will not separate from one another when you put them in a solution. They will stay intact, but because they have regions of positive and negative charge, water molecules will surround them and separate them from one another. So if you put sugar, for example, in water and stir it up, it will dissolve, but the sugar molecules stay intact, and they are separated from one another by the water molecules. Now, something else I want to discuss is the fact that, again, we'll be talking about solutions. And one aspect of solutions is that some solutions we describe as acids. And whether a solution is an acid or a base can have a dramatic effect actually on the shape or functioning of organic molecules. So an acid we can define as being any substance that when you dissolve it in water yields hydrogen ions. Hydrogen ions are very, very reactive, and so this is what gives acids their characteristics. This is why acid can burn skin or eat holes in your clothes and things like that. An example would be hydrochloric acid. Hydrochloric acid is considered a strong acid because 100% of that acid will dissociate in water, or virtually 100%. So when you put hydrochloric acid in water, it separates into H plus and Cl minus, and this is what makes it an acid. Now, another type of solution then would be a base or an alkali. And what defines them is that they tend to yield OH groups in water, although some people define them as being a substance that will absorb hydrogen ions. So we'll look at it as either situation, although I'm going to focus more on the yielding OH groups, which are called hydroxides. Hydroxides, OH groups, are also very reactive, and again, this gives the characteristics of bases. They also can burn skin, eat holes in your clothes, things like that. An example is sodium hydroxide. So when you put sodium hydroxide in water, it yields a sodium ion, but this is the business portion of a base. This is what makes a base, yielding the OHs. Now, you might think then that if you take a very reactive substance like an acid and a very reactive substance like a base, if you put them together, that this would create some super corrosive compound. But the reality is that the active portions of the acid and the base will neutralize one another, and it'll form a salt in water. So you're basically producing salt water when you put an acid and a base together. So for example, if we took hydrochloric acid and sodium hydroxide, again, it's the H plus that makes this an acid, it's the OH that makes this a base, and if you put H and OH together, you get water. And then the sodium and chlorine would ionically bond together, and so in this case it would be salt water. So again, they will neutralize one another if they're in equal concentrations and quantities. Now, we define acidity and basicity of solutions according to what's known as a pH scale. And this stands for the potential for hydrogen ions. And it's a negative log scale. So the lower the number of the scale, the more acidic the solution is. In other words, the more hydrogen ions there are. The larger the number, the fewer hydrogen ions there are. So again, as we go towards 0, and it's a scale that runs from 0 to 14. As we approach 0 then, what's happening is that there are more hydrogen ions in the solution and fewer hydroxide ions in the solution. At a pH of 7, we consider this a neutral solution. At pH 7, there are equal concentrations of H plus and OH minus, and as again, if you put those together, you've just got water. And then as you move towards 14, OH concentrations get greater, H plus concentrations get less. So when we look at the pH scale then, we can define acids and bases in different ways. So again, we can look at a pH of 3.2. Typically, pH less than 7 we would describe as an acid, and the closer you get to 1, the stronger the acid. So this is slightly over 7, so this would be a weak base. Now 14.8 is a trick question in a way because the scale only runs to 14, so that wouldn't be an acid or a base. I don't know, that would just be a miscalculation. 13.7, a very strong base. 8.0, kind of a weak base. 5.5, acidic. 1.7, very acidic. Now the other thing I want to point out here though is that any solution can be defined as an acid or a base. So if I were to look at this list and say, what is the strongest acid, you would say pH 1.7. If I were to look at the same list and say, which is the weakest base, really 1.7 would be the weakest base. So the strongest acid is the weakest base. So it's a little bit of semantics here, and you have to be a little careful of that. Again, generally over 7 base, under 7 acid, but we can use these terms kind of interchangeably. Any solution we can define in terms of acid or base. And then conversely, the strongest base in this group would be 13.7, and that would make it the weakest acid. Now, acidity or basicity of a solution is very, very important in life and in nature. And so we have a lot of mechanisms, for example, in our body to try to mitigate the effects of acids and to control pH, because if you start changing pH, it can affect the shape of biomolecules. So the role of a buffer is to maintain pH of a solution, to keep it at a specific pH. And it is the H plus concentration that really determines the pH of a solution. And many buffers are weak acids that help control pH by either binding or releasing H plus. So in our body, the primary buffer is carbonic acid. So carbonic acid will dissociate to form H plus and HCO3, which is bicarbonate ion. And this is a reversible reaction, so it can go in either direction. So the key is hydrogen ions. If hydrogen ions are released, removed from a solution, carbonic acid will dissociate to replace that. if you add hydrogen ions to a solution, it will combine with bicarbonate to reform carbonic acid. So these weak acids do not completely dissociate. So let's go ahead and look at an example here. So we're looking at a solution then where we have carbonic acid, so H2CO3. And we have an H+, and then we also have HCO3. So this is the bicarbonate ion here. So the pH of the solution is determined by the number of hydrogen ions. And we can see there's one hydrogen ion here, so this would have a certain pH. Now let's see what would happen. How would this buffer neutralize added base? So if we add OH to this solution, what would happen? Well, the OH would bind to the H+, forming water. Now, that's changed the pH. What happened to our hydrogen ion? It's gone. So, if we want to maintain the pH, that has to be replaced. So what will happen is that hydrogen ion from H2CO3 will replace the one that was lost. So we started with one free hydrogen ion, we end up with one free hydrogen ion. Now, let's see what would happen if we added an acid to the solution. So again, we're starting with one hydrogen ion. That's defining the pH of the solution. So at the end of this process, we should also have one hydrogen ion. So let's add an acid now. So that means you're adding another hydrogen ion. That will cause the existing hydrogen ion to bind to H2C, to a bicarbonate, reforming H2CO3. So just very quickly, I want to run through these again. So here comes an OH. It binds to form water. That changes the pH of the solution. So carbonic acid will release a hydrogen ion to get it back to its original pH. If you add an acid, you have a certain number of hydrogen ions in the solution. If you introduce another hydrogen ion, it will drive hydrogen ions into the bicarbonates, reforming carbonic acid. So again, we started with one hydrogen ion, we end up with hydrogen ion in each situation. So what the buffer is doing is not changing the pH of the solution, it's maintaining the pH of the solution as long as there's enough buffer to do that. So until the next time.